Okay, I was asked to come in today and speak a little bit about the successes that we've experienced in managing our land with prescribed fire. We purchased our first parcel of land in Northeast Jackson County in January of 1999. And since then, we have purchased some additional parcels of land so that now we have about 1,022 acres of land, primarily timberland, that we manage. Our long-term management goals are to restore that land, or most of that land, to longleaf pine savannas. Most of the land is on a 2-year fire return interval. Of course, our primary land management tool is fire. We have a burn plan that does not allow mechanical site preparation that would disturb the soil, and it does not allow for broadcast herbicide applications. So after purchasing the first 170 acres, I started burning that on a 2-year fire return interval. About 69 acres of it was, or actually 79 acres was in CRP program. It was old fields. The rest of it was in, really it was cut over pine, mixed pine hardwood. And it had grown up into a thicket of scrubs and vines to the point that you had to crawl to get through it. So we started burning, and my strategy was to any openings I could create with fire, or any existing openings that we had that I could expand with fire, I would go in and hand plant longleaf pines. So we started doing that. And the 79 acres of planted loblolly pines, which we have a photograph of that up here, it was thinned a couple of times. And many times I'd sit on my front porch and just stand just right in front of the house. And I'd think to myself, I'd give anything if these were longleaf pines. Then I could burn them, and I could thin them, and I could get regeneration and never have to clear cut it. Kind of the Stoddard-Neal approach for land management. So anyway, on October the 10th of 2018, I was sitting in the house, and Hurricane Michael was on the way. So this is about what it looked like around 4 o'clock in the afternoon. Okay, about 4:20. That's what it looked like. So I'd often wondered how to go about restoring that to longleaf pines when Michael made the decision. So I walked out on the porch during the eye of the storm, and the smell of turpentine almost knocked me over. I mean, you have never smelled anything so strong from all those broken off trees. About a quarter of them were uprooted, most of them broke off. So anyway, we got a logging crew out there. It was 2 men and a couple of trucks and a feller buncher and a skidder, and I got $65 a ton out of the salvage. And they started probably within 2 or 3 weeks of Michael. And I'd been getting about $30 a ton for those saw logs, and this was probably the finest stand of loblolly pines in Jackson County. But I was glad to get $6.50 a ton and get it cleaned up. And, let's see. Anyway, I had a neighbor that has a dozer, and he came in and he cleaned up a little of that in front of the house. And this is me and my dog out burning the piles. And then in the following winter, I had actually had this sprayed. This is old field, so under our management plan, I can broadcast herbicide on this. And so we had it sprayed. I burned it. We planted it in longleaf pine, and this is in December 2019. Had a fellow from Monticello planted. I actually brought a crew of Guatemalans over that planted it. And this is 2 years later. This was made last fall. And I usually burn my longleaf pines 2 years after I plant them. The first burn is usually in the winter. And this is some of that after it was burned last fall. You can see the longleaf pines are pretty well burned over. And they're still alive and well, and they're This was made about 2 weeks ago, and they're putting their candles out now. This is another one. This one was out of the grass stage, but it gives you a pretty good picture of the way longleaf pine needles are shaped and how they protect the bud from fire. So longleaf is pretty resistant to fire. I've killed very few longleaf pines at any age with my prescribed burning. Now the rest of the land that was not in the CRP program, as I said, was a dense thicket. Most of it, I just burned it to open it up and planted. This is a 7.5 acre stand that I had a fellow come in and actually roller chop it. He applied Valpar to it. This was before my management plan. I don't think the Valpar did much good because we put it out in September, but you know, it might have. But anyway, we still had a lot of competition. So I had them plant 500 trees per acre, and my wife and I spent a lot of time out there with machetes and hose and backpack sprayers, getting the competition down. Beauty Bear is one of the big competitors. And this is the stand. They planted 500 trees per acre. Michael thinned it somewhat, but it came through pretty well. You can see a few dead trees in there. And the ground cover we're looking at there is not wiregrass, but it's black needlegrass, which is a pretty common grass that grows along the, actually on natural levees and the floodplain or the slope forest along the Chattahoochee River. I didn't find any wiregrass in there, but we do have several tortoises in there, as you can see. And Jan has bought some signs to mark some of them with. Now, this is some of that same land that where I was burning to try to get openings, and this is where I went back and planted the longleaf pine in those openings. You can see the wiregrass. Now, I didn't find any native wiregrass. Some may have come back after we started burning, and it was so suppressed, you know, that I wasn't able to find it. But I did direct seed some in there, and I think most of this is what I seeded in. Another photograph of the ground cover, and this is muley grass that I did not plant. Now, this stand is part of a 160 acre parcel that we purchased across the highway to the west. It was really pretty much mixed pine hardwood when we bought it, pretty dense. It had burned. My neighbor and I had helped her burn it over the years, but it hadn't done a lot in the way of getting rid of the hardwood. So I had a chipper come in and they chipped it. I went in and marked any longleaf pines that were in that field. This is about 60 acres that we clear cut. And you can see a few of the longleaf pines in the background. So this was a pretty hot fire last fall. Another shot of the same field where the fire didn't get quite so hot. And you can see one of the trees in the back. When I had that chipped, I went in and flagged some of the trees in there. That was a big post oak that Michael put on the ground. We also had the state champion cherry bark oak on that property, and it looks just like that now after Michael. Now, this is a picture of what I call the lake block. This is a 111 acre parcel. It had 40-year-old slash pine primarily on it. And Michael took about 70% of it out. It was already fairly thin. I got a logging crew out there to clean it up. They were paying me $1 a ton for the salvage. And I was glad to get rid of it at that. But then the mills quit taking it. So later on, I got another logger out there, and I had whatever was standing, I marked the utility poles. And the logger paid me $65 a ton for the utility poles, some of the same stuff that was going for $1 a ton earlier, and about $30 a ton for the saw logs. And not only did he take the standing timber, but he took some of the stuff that had blown over. So I got $30 a ton for some of that was going for $1 a ton earlier. So that worked out pretty good. And this is one of the trees. That was planted last December, and this is one of the trees. So there are trees out there. This is another photograph of some of that same land. When I bought that, that ground cover was in pretty good condition. It had never been farmed and it had not been really intensively site prepped. So not a lot of mechanical disturbance over at least some of it. And this is more of the same with a couple of the Michael monuments still standing. Now this is part of a 27-acre strip that we own that's on the south side of Buena Vista Landing Road that goes into the Chattahoochee River. This is the second burn. This was planted in November of 2015. It's got pretty hot. Along the edge of that, there was a strip of grass and weeds that the farmer didn't disc up. And when the fire got out there, I had a north wind when I burned it. And I stepped over a couple of rows and it got out there, it got really hot. But I don't think I killed any trees. As you can see, they're putting candles out and they look healthy. Now this is part of that CRP land that's to the, what I call the east field, east of where the house is. And, you know, people typically talk about planting longleaf pines in your driest areas, your poorest soils. They typically want to plant loblolly and slash pine on wetter ground. Well, I get a lot better survival in these wet areas, or at least I have in the last several years. I had a good survival here. The sand hills to the west, I lost quite a bit of that in the March drought after they were planted. So these are doing pretty good. And you can see it's pretty wet. There's a standing water. Now, moving to another parcel of land, we call this the Eden Tract. This is about 6 miles north of where our home is. And this stand was, it's about a 70-acre parcel of land that had, I think, about 32-year-old slash pine on it. It had been thinned pretty heavily. Michael took out about 40% of what was left. I had a logging crew come out to they were supposed to take the down timber and leave the standing timber. But when I got out there, they had a guy out there on the fellow butcher and he was thinning what was left. So I went out there and at risk of life and limb, it's funny, these guys never seem to see you when they're in this equipment, because he would pick up these big bundles of trees and slam them down, and I'd jump out of the way and he'd slam another, you know. This went on for a while, and I finally stopped him and he got out and he was mad as he could be, and he come out there and said, I told you, I said, you're not supposed to be cutting my standing timber. He said, my boss told me to thin this. I said, well, I'm the boss out here, and they left. So anyway, that was planted last year in December, the longleaf pines. Again, this was hand planted and it was burned for site prep. Now I'll talk about site prep a little bit. I burn this land every 2 years. So when we do clear cut it, we have the hardwood pretty well under control. So almost all of the site preparation I do is just a good late summer, early fall burn. You know, Andy was talking about May and June being that period when fires really burn hot. You know, it's dry, windy conditions, dry, hot, windy conditions. It's late May, early June, and in September. Well, I usually burn it do my site prep burns in September when I have really dry, hot, windy weather, and I get a good site prep burn. And that's about all I do, other than sometimes I go in with a four-wheeler or a backpack sprayer and ride around and spray a few beauty berries, or, you know, some of the things that are problematic that fire doesn't seem to control. Now this is a stand right across the road this was planted in, this is a 5-year-old longleaf stand it was planted by a Mexican crew several years ago. The crew leader was named Geronimo, and Geronimo and his band of 12 showed up about 9 o'clock in the morning. They planted, it's a 50-acre site. I was planting about 630 trees to the acre. They planted that 32,000 longleaf pine tublings, and then they when they got to the west end of the stand, I had 10,000 wiregrass tubers. And so they started planting those in between the rows and until they ran out. And so they planted the 10,000 wiregrass tubers and 32,000 longleaf pines, and they were leaving there at 3:30 in the afternoon. And again, this was, whenever I cleared it 5 years ago, it had been burned on a 2-year rotation for about 14 or 15 years. And my only site prep, again, was a good hot fire. This is the same stand, just taken recently. That burn was last summer. So this is, 8 or 9 months later. And this is what those slash pine plantations looked like before I cut it and replanted it to longleaf pine. Again, it's off-site slash. Of course, it is sand hills. It's not really xeric sand hill, but there is a little turkey oak in there. There's blue jack oak and that sort of thing. The slash pines are not doing real well. We would call them, I guess I'd call them off-site slash, but I tend to call every slash pine that's been planted off-site because in my opinion, and from what I've seen over the last 50 years, slash pine isn't truly a wetland tree. Historically, these fires that took place in late May and early June, as Andy said, would have kept slash and loblolly pines out of the longleaf pine areas, with the possible exception of down on the coast where you get a sea breeze during the daytime and the wind blows away from the coast. So a lot of times you get areas along the coast that slash pine probably did occur in the uplands, in the flatwoods. Now this is another photograph of some of that slash pine that was 32-year-old slash pine. I've not found any wiregrass in any of that. That belonged to St. Joe Paper Company, and they seem to have eliminated every clump of wiregrass. I know there was wiregrass there at one time, but they didn't get rid of the little blue stem. So that's a little blue stem in there. And this is a photograph that was taken facing east. The previous one was facing west. I'm standing on a roadway. So on the east side, I'd planted wiregrass, and I direct seeded this wiregrass. It came from a local seed source. We collect it, and I go out with the seed and just take a rake and rake the duff away and drop a pinch of seed and step on it. And if you have good viability, in a year, you'll have a good clump of wiregrass, a year and a half, actually. So it looked like that at about a year and a half, although that's probably 5 years old now. And if I'm going to collect seed, I do try to burn the wiregrass in the lightning season, which is late May, early June. That's when you get your best flowering and I think your greatest viability in your seed. And that's always been, my belief. And a number of years ago, I called the state nursery down in Levy County and talked to the people down there that collect seed, and they told me that they got their best seed viability if they burned their land every 2 years in late May or early June. And so they grow a lot of wiregrass. This is a 10-year-old planted longleaf stand. It was, I had burned it for about 10 years on a 2-year rotation. I clear cut it, removed the slash pine, and burned it for site prep. I had it machine planted. They used a V-blade planter, but they did not scalp. The V-blade is 5 feet wide. The scalper that they had in there, which scalped about 2 feet. Now, I don't allow a 5-foot strip of my land to be scalped because I want to protect my ground cover. But the 2-foot scalper I thought worked really well because it got the competition back away from the trees. And so I thought that worked really great, except in 2010, we did not get any rain that summer. So I got about a 15 or 20% survival. So I had him come back the following year and plant in between the rows. They were on a 12-foot space. The rows were 12 feet apart. So he came in and he planted between the rows. So I have 6-foot rows now, but the original rows are pretty sparse. So the second time I got a really good lift. So now I probably have more trees per acre than I really want, but I will be able to thin them eventually. Now this is some of the same stand, but it's on the east side of the road, and that's where I've done the ground cover restoration. I planted all that wiregrass, direct seeded it. This is more of the same stand, the left having been burned, the right hasn't. Now this is a strip of land that St. Joe had left the longleaf pines on for some reason. They'd interplanted slash pine. It had not burned in God knows how long, so it was really a hardwood thicket with slash and longleaf pines protruding from the top of the thicket. So I started going through there with Valpar, granular Valpar. Usually they apply Valpar with a helicopter, at least granular Valpar. I applied mine with a teaspoon, and I got rid of the hardwood, and I started burning it late in the summer. I found that late summer burns, August, September burns are very effective in controlling woody shrubs. I know that I've heard people discuss a season of burn and May and June being a good time, and certainly I think any growing season burn is better to control woody shrubs, but I found late summer burn seems to work better, because if you burn them in August or September or October, then your woody shrubs will sprout, and then you get a frost on them, so it knocks them back again, so you get a double whammy. And I brought this up at an earlier prescribed fire meeting, and Dale Wade was in the audience, and he said, yeah, there is data to support that. So I felt like my observations were pretty good. So anyway, what we're looking at are the longleaf pines, and this is a regeneration that I've gotten. And this is scheduled to be burned this May. That's another photograph of the same area. That's a younger regeneration. I don't think I'll kill any of them, may burn. Now this is an area that the slash pine had been thinned. It was fairly thin. I came in here and interplanted longleaf pines in there a number of years back. I know that some of the agencies have done some experimentation with interplanting longleaf amongst slash pine. This is slash pine. The density was probably 40 to 45 basal area. I think if you get much more than that in the way of canopy density, you probably won't be successful. I've gone into some of my loblolly plantations on that CRP land when the first thinning took place. It was a 4th row thinning, and I went in and planted longleaf pines in those takeout rows. I didn't get any survival, but here they've done quite well. And this is another photograph of the same interplanting. Now this is my neighbor's property to the east. The slash pine's the same age. I'm standing on the fire break, and this is the difference in land that's burned that's not burned at all. Actually, he's burned it once in 20 years, and land that's burned on a 2-year fire return interval. So he's actually burned it once in 20 years, and I have to burn it. And we have a good gopher tortoise population. When I first bought the land, I saw a little of this lupin in there. Now it's pretty common. This little plant is in that 7.5 acre longleaf plantation there at Buena Vista Landing Road, where the house is. And the story behind that, I was going through there with my backpack sprayer, applying Valpar as a band spray over the longleaf pines the year after they were planted. It was in May. This thing flowers in May. And it's Spigelia gentianoides, or gentian pink root. It's a federally listed endangered. But I was familiar with the plant. And as I was spraying, I saw it about the time the Valpar hit it. I said, oh shit. That's a definite oh shit. So I got down with a napkin and I wiped the thing off, you know, oh, Jesus, yeah, I've killed it. So anyway, sure enough, it shriveled up and appeared to have died. And I came back a couple of weeks later when it had sprouted again, it came right back. And I later found two more. So I've been watching these three little plants since since May of 2004. They get about that tall, and some years they don't get that tall. Some years they're 3 or 4 inches tall and don't flower. Now, I led a survey a number of years ago in the Appalachian Wildlife Management Area where they have a good population of them. And if I found the little plants about that big, I just assumed they were seedlings. And the larger ones were older and flowering. Well, that's not the case. Some years they get big and flower, some years they don't. But you think about it when you're walking on the ground and stepping on these things, or you're roller chopping or you're bedding, a lot of this stuff we're killing is pretty ancient. I mean, this thing, you kind of wonder if it was here when Washington crossed the Delaware. It hadn't changed a bit in 18 years. I've been watching it, so something to think about. And this is a quinquefoil that typically occurs in the along the Appalachian Trail in the Carolinas and Georgia. It's not considered to be a fire-adapted species, but I started finding it. I found two little patches of it after we started burning. And I tried to key it out. It wouldn't key. I went to Angus Golson with it. It had a little yellow flower on it. And it wouldn't key in any Florida books. And he said, well, that's potentilla. And potentilla simplex is what it is. And so we got out the Radford, which is a key of the Carolinas, and it keys right out to potentilla simplex in the Radford. So this is the only known occurrence of this plant. There's I have two little patches of about a dozen plants each. It's the only known occurrence in the state of Florida. So there weren't any of the Florida books because it had never been reported here. And this is another little member of the morning glory family that's state listed endangered. We find in that 7.5 acre block that I burn every 2 years. It's in flower right now. And of course, the land is being restored. It will be protected in perpetuity against subdivision. It has to remain in timberland. It specifically prohibits any circular irrigation rigs because this parcel of land, the parcel of land we have that's up on the Neal Landing Road, is pretty much surrounded by circular irrigation rigs, at least on 3 sides. So it can't be subdivided. It has to remain in timber, but I specifically put in there no circular irrigation rigs. So it should be there forever. And the management plan calls for burning every 2 to 3 years. And I think tall timbers will hold my feet to the fire, and whoever is managing that in the future, it will hold their feet to the fire. So that's our success story. So, any questions?
How do you direct your wiregrass with a grasslander or something?
I use a fire rake. Yep. I take my fire rake and I take the seed. Now, sometimes I just walk through and throw out. I go and collect the seed, and then I do have a little collector, but a lot of times we just do it by hand. We do it on a small, but I do it over the years, so we don't do a lot every year. But I will go through some and collect the seed, and I'll go back and cut the cones off of the grass. And I've got a patch that I planted just to collect seed from a local source. And I'll take those cones with the seed, whatever seed's left on, just toss them around the woods. And I get wiregrass from that. But the seeds I collect, I take that fire rake and I'll scrape a little patch and drop a pinch of seed and step on it. And if the seed viability is good, in 1.5 years, I'll have a nice clump of wiregrass. So works pretty well.
Just like a 1-by-1 area?
Yeah, I just scrape, it doesn't matter. As long as you expose with bare mineral soil and rough it up a little bit and drop a little handful of wiregrass seed, stomp it in, that's all it needs. If those seeds are viable.
What about fertilizer? Have you ever experimented?
I've never tried fertilizing it.
Doesn't work.
Yeah. It doesn't work. Okay, Greg can probably tell you. But like I say, you're putting a number of seeds there. If I put 25 seeds and 15 of them germinate, in 1.5 years, I'll have a pretty good clump of wiregrass. And I've burned it, it'll flower. I mean, the seed collection site that we planted, which is about a half acre. I did that, and a year and a half later, I come back and burned it. It you know, flowered and produced seed. So it looks great.
It does look great.
Okay.
Any more questions for Guy?